Hi everyone, welcome, Happy New Year. Hope everyone had a great start to the term. Today we're very lucky to have Professor Heidi Hurd, who's Ross and Ellen Workman Chair in Law and co-director of the program in Law and Philosophy at the University of Illinois College of Law. And she's presenting a very interesting and provoking paper. I love the title, as I was telling you, both of the paper you're presenting and as well the book, because this is part of a book project called The Virtue of Bankruptcy. So the paper today is Should we forgive our debtors? And yes, as usual, the format is going to be 30 to 45 minutes of a short presentation of the paper, followed by the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Philippa and Javier and Trent. I'm really very delighted to be here. And it's a great opportunity to walk you through a set of chapters in this book manuscript co-authored with one of my colleagues at Illinois, Ralph Brubaker. This is a book that is under contract to Oxford Press, but I swear to God, at some point they're just going to kick us out because this book just will not get done. And so we keep hoping that if we, present bite-sized pieces of it, we'll push this thing along. So yes, entitled The Virtue of Bankruptcy, the book is about the first principles of debt forgiveness that underlie bankruptcy law. It's about why American, and as I understand it, English law, as well as legal regimes of many other countries, discharge debts so as to afford debtors a fresh financial start, when so doing effectively forces creditors and those to whom they pass the costs of their debts to subsidize others' life choices and to pay for others' mistakes. So it's about why both American and English law forgive debtors for breaking promises and breaching contracts and failing to pay fair taxes and defaulting on damage judgments required to compensate those they've injured, when, of course, as a general matter, our criminal justice systems punish those who do wrong, our contract regimes enforce contractual obligations that were the result of fair deals, our tort law systems demand compensation from those who cause injury, and our tax laws require that everyone contribute to the support of just public institutions. So the project that my co-author and I set for ourselves in the book is really twofold. We first seek to taxonomize and critically evaluate the dominant justifications for personal bankruptcy law that have been advanced to date in the theoretical literature about bankruptcy. It's a pretty thin literature. And so I invite those of you with philosophical interests and aspirations, please come over and appreciate how thin the theoretical literature is, and particularly thin by those who have philosophical chops. And it could benefit enormously from all of you turning your attention to it. We then, after the taxonomizing and critical evaluation of other theories, we then seek to offer an alternative vindication of the institution of debt relief that escapes the difficulties that past theories have encountered. Now, my part of the project is the purely philosophical part, and that's the part I'm going to focus on today. My co-author is a bankruptcy specialist, and so it's his job to sort of demonstrate how the philosophical rubber hits the doctrinal road. And so if you have doctrinal questions, I will be thoroughly incapable of answering them, and I will just sort of say, I'll have to ask my co-author and get back to you. I have managed, hi Marie, I have managed to work on this book for years without learning essentially any bankruptcy law at all. So I have to leave the doctrinal applications to those who actually know things. Okay, so within the literature that's devoted to justifying and explaining any given area of law, one can always extract three distinct kinds of theories that will compete for dominance: utilitarian theories, rights-based theories, and distributive justice theories. And so it is in bankruptcy law that one can tease out and taxonomize views that reflect these same three normative preoccupations. So as you can imagine, utilitarian theories have been the favorite of those who bring law and economics analysis to bear on the subject, and we devote early chapters to critiquing both the normative defensibility and the doctrinal fit of utilitarian accounts of bankruptcy relief. And I'm not going to say anything here about those doomed efforts. Instead, I'm going to take you through two theories of debt relief, and I didn't send this to you to read, so I'm just going to walk you through very briefly two theories of debt relief. One, a rights-based theory, the second, a distributive justice theory, because these have most captured the philosophical hearts of those who've sought to offer non-utilitarian justifications for forgiving people their financial obligations. And what I want to demonstrate is that both of these accounts of debt relief leave a lot to be philosophically desired. Indeed, our argument in the book, after considerably more argumentation that I can sum up here, is that one cannot construct a defensible account of debt forgiveness that relies on claims of distributive justice or that trades on the notion that people have rights to debt relief. And so then I'll outline for you the alternative Eritaic account that we construct in part 4 of the book, chapters 9 and 10 of which I sent to you, an account that we believe overcomes the problems that we identify with the traditional approaches to the justification of personal bankruptcy. So let me begin with the first non-utilitarian justification for having a bankruptcy system that absolves people of the duties that are imposed upon them by contract law, tort law, property law, family law, tax law, and so forth. On this first theory, debt relief is a debtor's right. Now, this theory, advanced by Tony Kronman, who was a previous dean of the Yale Law School, is oxymoronically self-described, both as an autonomy theory and as a paternalistic theory. It's predicated on the claim, as Kronman puts it, that, quote, I'm going to do a lot of quoting because you just can't do better than quote Tony Kronman on this topic, that, quote, a person who would give away too much of his own liberty has a right to be protected from himself. In Kronman's view, a large debt can be, and typically is, quote, a source of regret. And regret can be significantly, quote, demoralizing. Consumers ought to be accorded a right to dismiss burdensome debts as a means of ensuring that they'll be able to escape the dead hand of past choices made by past selves with whom they no longer personally identify. So as Kronman argues, a person who's strapped with the consequences of decisions made by a past self that now may seem pointless or evil is likely to feel, quote, self-betrayal, a kind that weakens his confidence in his ability to make lasting commitments, this is quote, and guard the things he cares for, and this in turn strikes at his self-respect. So in a case of inescapable debt, the present self who has to bear the obligation tends to feel alienated from the previous self who incurred the debt because he views that debt as foolish. He takes the debt to be a product of short-sighted temptation on the part of the previous self who insufficiently appreciated the long-term pain of short-term gratification. And so the authentic present self has to be released from the choices of the prior self because those choices reflect insufficient information and insufficient regard for the consequences to the future self. So as Kronman argues, bankruptcy law ensures that a debtor can be restored, quote, to some measure of confidence in his present capacity to arrange his future as he wishes. Without such confidence, he writes, a debtor may lose even that minimum of self-respect that is a condition for his taking an interest in himself and in his own life. Okay, so I want to say two things here about this thesis. So first, to put it bluntly, I think that talk of multiple or conflicted selves in this context is a bunch of hooey. I mean, that's, the best philosophical term I can muster, right? Unless someone suffers from true multiple personality disorder, is otherwise afflicted with a mental illness or a condition that results in dissociative behavior of a sort akin to the sleepwalker or the hypnotic patient or the victim of brainwashing, I don't believe that she's so alienated from her past choices as to be non-responsible for them and thus undeserving of their burdens. Indeed, I challenge you to identify anyone amongst your circle of acquaintances who can both be thought credibly free of significant mental illness and who, quote, regards his earlier decisions as a foreign element whose continuing influence appears senseless from the standpoint of his present goals, so much so that he's demoralized by regret and doubts his ability to make lasting commitments and guard the things he cares for. And what a bunch of hysteria, right? Second, I think the talk of competing selves is a smokescreen that disguises a move from soft paternalism to hard paternalism. Now, soft paternalism, of course, is exercised when others seek to better the circumstances of a person by that person's own measure, right? Hard paternalism, in contrast, takes it to be legitimate to override others' goals and values when those can be thought to be objectively irrational or immoral. The hard paternalist is prepared to declare something a good for someone, even if it is not now nor ever will be valued by that person upon whom it's imposed. Now, Kronman ostensibly casts his defense of the right of bankruptcy discharge in the language of soft paternalism because he claims to be concerned to advance the actual choices and the felt values of the current authentic self. But by bifurcating debtors into two or more selves, he affords himself the opportunity for hard paternalism without having to admit its motivation or defend its terms. Because burdensome debts that were unwisely incurred are assigned to debtors' past selves, while rational and moral ends are attributed to their present authentic selves. Present selves are then thought to have a right to be released from the choices of the past selves because those past selves are worthy objects of hard paternalism, their choices too ill-conceived to be honored. Now, it may be that hard paternalism is at least sometimes justified. And it may be that desperate debtors are good candidates for such paternalism because their debts might, prove that they're incapable of adopting rational means to worthy ends. But I reached two conclusions on this matter in the chapter on Kronman's particular brand of rights-based bankruptcy theorizing. I mean, first, Kronman doesn't do the theoretical legwork to legitimize the sort of hard paternalism that his theory in fact disguises. And second, if such legwork were done, Kronman wouldn't be in possession of a theory of personal bankruptcy that could credibly be called a rights-based theory, because nobody thinks that people have rights that protect autonomous lives when their choices are subject to the scrutiny of others and dismissed as non-autonomous when they're deemed imprudent or unfortunate. Yes? Okay, now let me briefly give you a taste of the claims made by those who take bankruptcy relief to be justified not as a means of vindicating debtors' rights, but as a means of achieving distributive justice. So distributive justice theories of bankruptcy, or of any other field of law for that matter, share the view that legal rights and responsibilities can be justified only if they advance the just distribution of society's benefits and burdens. So now the theory in the literature on personal bankruptcy that most obviously owes its philosophical allegiance to distributive justice goes by the name of rehabilitationism. Rehabilitationists are concerned with restoring to their ex ante moral status those who have financially indentured themselves to others in ways that have diminished their standing legally, morally, economically, socially, culturally, psychologically, fill in the blank. So these theorists can be separated from utilitarians by their willingness to suffer a loss of utility in order to effectuate this rehabilitative goal. And they can be separated from rights theorists by their indifference to the degree to which those who are in disadvantaged circumstances were autonomously responsible for their plight. Now, interestingly, it's this distributive justice rationale for personal bankruptcy that has become the dominant rival to utilitarian accounts in numerous countries. I mean, just as an example, the Israeli Knesset passed the law for insolvency and economic recovery just recently, which explicitly embraces the claim that, quote, rehabilitation is the main purpose of insolvency proceedings and it explicitly rejects, quote, past views that insolvency laws should seek to punish or educate debtors. So this view squarely rejects the claim that what debtors are entitled to is a function of the autonomy with which they incurred their debts. Now, how can this be? We all know that Robert Nozick insisted that no one can complain of an unequal distribution of wealth. In fact, no one can complain of poverty if it's the product of voluntary and informed wealth transfers. The question is this: if people who labor under crushing debts seemingly incurred those debts with the sort of knowledge and information and freedom that we demand of any transaction or allocation deemed voluntary, informed, and fair, how is it that they should be released from those debts as a matter of distributive justice? Well, the rehabilitationist has an answer. It's grounded in an argument analogous to the one advanced by rehabilitationists in the criminal law arena. In the criminal law arena, the claim is made by rehabilitationists that a criminal is as much a victim of his crime as is his targeted victim. Well, now, how could this be the case? Why would the wrongdoer also be the wronged? Well, the rehabilitationist answers, because crime is a disease to be cured, it's a pathology to be treated. Just as we wouldn't punish someone for having epilepsy or a heart condition, so we shouldn't punish someone who resorts to violence or deceit, because in so doing, he manifests not wickedness, but illness. Now, in bankruptcy law, the analogous claim that's made by rehabilitationists like Elizabeth Warren, who's a very dear friend of mine, so I get to talk about her, and she'd be happy to be talked about in these terms, right? The analogous claim made by rehabilitationists like Elizabeth is that debt is a condition analogous to an ailment for which debtors are not at fault. It besets people in a manner similar to an illness deriving from cognitive failures, from cognitive biases and volitional shortcomings for which agents are not to blame. The upshot of a rehabilitationist argument is that debtors figure among those who are morally eligible for society's care and concern, their misfortunes being no more their fault than those of the ailing, the elderly, the handicapped, the homeless, and the orphaned. Now, when cast in these terms, rehabilitationism is a species of distributive justice theory because it explains why anyone who seeks to redistribute wealth from the haves to the have-nots ought to be moved to include debtors in the class of worthy have-nots, despite the fact that in many circumstances, their ostensibly voluntary choices were the cause of their neediness. Now, I take there to be the same sorts of normative complaints against or with rehabilitationism in bankruptcy theory as have been raised in response to rehabilitationism in criminal law theory. And let me just take up two of the many that we talk about in our book. So first, theorists who worry about rights will recognize that the consequence of debt relief differs from the consequences of excusing offenders from punishment. Because when offenders are excused from punishment and sent instead for rehabilitation, no one's punished in their stead. But when debtors are released from debt so as to be rehabilitated, others are forced to shoulder their debts in their stead. So theorists who are concerned about allocating praise and blame, benefits and burdens in accordance with people's just deserts can worry that rehabilitationism in bankruptcy law results in people bearing financial liabilities that are not theirs as a matter of right and that are thus not theirs as a matter of desert. And second, the argument that debtors who find themselves burdened by the financial weight of their past decisions are like children or are like those who are diseased is fantastically condescending. Yeah? I mean, none of us really believe it, and none of us should believe it. While there may be identifiable mental illnesses that sadly cause people to borrow and spend compulsively, the average person who has chalked up more debt than she can reasonably carry cannot and should not be thought mentally ill or irresponsible for her choices in ways that reduce her to the status of a child or an invalid. I mean, while the hard paternalist is prepared to bite the bullet of condescension, most take the fact that a theory is elitist to be a failing, not a virtue, and so it is with rehabilitationism. Well, now I've given you a taste, just a taste, for the kinds of criticisms that we level in the book against rights-based and distributive justice-based accounts of bankruptcy discharge, just to taste because our analyses go on for chapters. But let me outline for you now the quite different and quite novel theory in which our book culminates. A theory that rejects all claims that debt relief is a matter of right or even a matter of justice by those who are released from their financial obligations. So, as we ultimately argue, debt forgiveness is not about maximizing aggregate welfare. It's not about vindicating individual rights, either debtors or creditors. It's not about achieving distributive justice. It's rather about achieving personal virtue, not that of creditors or of debtors, but of our own as citizens of a just society. In short, bankruptcy is about us. It's about you and me. It's not about them. It's an institution required by people of good character who live in a world of scarce resources with others of variable talents and dispositions and opportunities and luck. It's an institution that relies on the variable cost of credit to transfer the debts of those who cannot bear them to those of us who can, in a manner that enables us to fulfill our erotic obligations of charity. Now, a defense of this thesis requires a fair bit of fancy footwork. And I'm going to take you through three of those steps. Three of the steps you have to be able to perform to dance this dance. So it requires first an account of how virtues generate oughts that obligate us, despite others having no rights to our manifestations of virtue. It requires, second, a defense of the specific claim that debt forgiveness is among the virtues to which we all ought to aspire. And finally, it requires an account of how individual virtues can be aggregated, as it were, so as to explain how a legal institution like the personal bankruptcy discharge can be justified by serving our collective personal virtues. So let me just sort of tap dance through these moves fairly quickly. So first, how can we say that we ought, you and me, that we ought to forgive the debts of others when Ralph and I have already concluded in earlier chapters that there's no basis for thinking that debtors have rights to debt forgiveness or that debtors are otherwise deserving of debt forgiveness? Well, we take people to have both deontic and erotaic obligations or duties. So deontic duties, as you all well know, concern actions that are prohibited or required at razor points in time, actions that are a matter of right by others. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, do feed your children, do clothe them, do educate them, do rescue them from peril. Erotaic duties, in contrast, concern not actions, but character traits, dispositions that have to be cultivated or suppressed over a lifetime in order to be thought a person of good character. Dispositions of courage, kindness, generosity of judgment, and so forth. Now, it seems clear that people erotaically ought to cultivate certain character traits that will, by their nature, motivate actions that are not deontically required, that is, that are not a matter of right on the part of others. So, for example, most of us in this room, I assume, think that we each ought to be the sorts of people who would react courageously in a crisis, the sorts of people who would run into a burning building to save a stranger, even as we would maintain, I assume, that the stranger would have no right to our heroism under those circumstances. Now, it's commonly thought that among the traits of character that make for a virtuous person are dispositions to be both generous and forgiving. And if one is successful in cultivating these character traits, one will be motivated to give others things to which they have no rights. One will be motivated to forgive others' missteps and misdeeds under circumstances in which they have no right to forgiveness and in which one is subject to no deontic duty to be forgiving. Now, of course, forgiveness reflects vice rather than virtue if it's bestowed in circumstances in which people have done deeds that are objectively unforgivable. And so that brings us to the second question. Whether it's virtuous to release others from financial debts that they owe when they cannot be said to deserve that relief, to have rights to that relief. So the answer, very quickly, put in a coarse way, is this. There is no virtue to beating a dead horse. There's no virtue to milking a dry cow or jumping up and down on a turnip in an effort to extract blood. Yeah, criminal prosecutors who seek to extract every ounce of deserved suffering from wrongdoers who are already in a pitiful state reveal a darkness of soul that merits blame, not praise. And creditors who seek to collect on debts from those who are already failing to make ends meet similarly manifest a mean-spiritedness that makes their assertion of their rights subrogatory, right? An abuse of their rights. Now, the coarse version of our thesis is, of course, too coarse. Because the thesis is at best uninteresting and at worst incoherent if it finds virtue in the forgiveness of a debt only when repayment of that debt would be literally impossible. Because, one who gives up nothing can hardly be thought to exhibit moral merit, right? But our ultimate claim is that the virtuous person does not press his repayment rights against a debtor when so doing will inflict genuine hardship and serious psychological distress. Now, hardship and distress are hard to define, but we take it that debt forgiveness is virtuously bestowed in response to a combination of objective and subjective factors. So first, it's responsive to circumstances that make it objectively difficult for a person to meet her basic needs and to satisfy weighty obligations, to feed, clothe, and educate her children, to meet employment expectations, and to safeguard others from accidental injury. And second, our theory also places weight on the psychological stress that accompanies such objectively constraining circumstances, on the felt sense of oppression that so commonly besets those whose ability to meet their daily needs and obligations is in doubt. Now, we take virtue to metamorphosize into vice when it's exercised in ways that permit others to escape obligations that they can, in fact, meet or bear, either because they objectively have the means to do so or because they have the psychological fortitude to keep trying, right? So ours is a theory that places moral weight on others' needs, not on their felt or perceived or claimed needs, but on their real ones, some of which, of course, will be psychological in nature. So put differently, ours is a theory that takes real financial hardship, real poverty, and its accompanying psychological stress to be morally special. Our claim is that the virtuous person is properly moved by genuine poverty when it's accompanied by psychological strain, but not, we believe, by the conditions of those who are financially hypochondriacal or still financially optimistic, and certainly not by the conditions of those who simply seek to jealously guard lifestyles to which we'd all like to become accustomed. So, right? Okay, now, step 3. The construction of an account of how individual virtues can be translated into, as it were, institutional virtues, so as to be able to say of the institution of bankruptcy discharge that it possesses institutional virtue by aggregating and coordinating the moral demands to which all of us are individually subject. So to be clear, we're not proposing to move from the thesis that we should each forgive our debtors as a matter of personal virtue to the thesis that credit card companies and other business entities should, as a matter of corporate virtue, forgive their debtors. I mean, shareholders and managers shouldn't check their consciences at the boardroom door, but we think that talk of American Express being responsive to a corporate virtue theory is too pie in the sky. Our argument is rather that the rest of us have erratatic obligations to be the sorts of people who forgive the financial obligations that are breached to us. And think about it. When those who are in desperate straits default on loans within an open credit economy, they effectively pass their debts to us, to you and me, in the form of increased credit costs and product prices. So we are the ultimate creditors of those whose debts outpace their ability to pay them. We are collectively the ones with our boots on their necks. But of course, we can never know or never find those whose defaults are responsible for the higher prices of products and credit that we've been forced to pay. So we have no way of directly forgiving those who are in fact in debt to us. If virtue requires us to absorb the crushing debts of those who are effectively indentured to us, then we're going to require our government to create an institutional mechanism that will systematically afford debtors relief from the financial burdens that oppress them. And so we have personal bankruptcy, which systematically fulfills our eretaic obligations to those within our community who are effectively in debt to us and who are in need of our charity. Now, we argue at some length that this account of our institution of debt relief is free of many of the problems, we hope all of the problems, identified with past theories, while escaping fresh complaints that on first impression might be laid at its door. So let me just close by giving you first a fast illustration of the ability of the theory to explain a core aspect of bankruptcy law that can't be explained by other theories. And then a philosophical challenge that we think appears initially damning, but is ultimately perfectly defeasible. Okay, so take the explanatory challenge. One thing that everyone who seeks to justify personal bankruptcy is called upon to explain is why it's an inalienable legal right. It cannot be waived. It cannot be bought. It cannot be sold. It cannot be gifted. How can our theory account for why, say, bargainers within market transactions are not allowed to contract away their later ability to discharge their debts in bankruptcy? Well, the answer is that our theory doesn't derive the inalienability of the legal right of discharge from the needs or the rights of debtors. Instead, it derives it from the needs and rights of those of us who are ultimately called upon to be charitable in response to those who find themselves destitute. Once again, it's not about them, it's about us. Others can't sell our concern for them. Others can't preclude us from doing what it's virtuous of us to do. Others can't bargain away our expressions of our good character. The right of discharge is inalienable by debtors because it's not their right at all. It's ours, right? Personal bankruptcy reflects our right to forgive, not a debtor's right to be forgiven. And as such, it's not a right that a debtor can sell or trade or give away. Now, let me wrap it up by anticipating a challenge that appears on its face to be very troubling. It appears that our argument amounts to the claim that the point of bankruptcy law is to coerce virtue. It's to force creditors to be forgiving, not because it will enhance social welfare, not because debtors deserve to be forgiven, but because forgiveness is a virtue. But, this challenge goes, but virtue either cannot be coerced as a moral matter, or it should not be coerced as a political matter. Virtue cannot be coerced, so the argument goes, because as soon as a virtue like charity is required by law, it becomes a tax, right? And it thereby loses its pedigree as an expression of virtue. And virtue should not be coerced, even if it can be, because classic liberalism is right in insisting that the state ought to confine itself to legislating the right, not the good, right? It ought to enforce the conditions of peaceful interaction without attempting to perfect human character. Now, if we were arguing for the coercion of virtue, if we were being perfectionists about the law of bankruptcy, these would be damning arguments, particularly for me, since I've written a whole bunch defending liberal conceptions of the state, right? But we're not doing this. This construal of our argument is a misconstrual. Our argument is that our government owes it to the virtuous to enable their virtue, not that it ought to coerce the vicious to become virtuous. Now, we fully acknowledge, of course, that because behaving virtuously or viciously is a choice that one is deontically entitled to make, there will be those among us who, if squarely given the choice of whether to forgive their debtors, would choose to continue to press their rights of repayment. But because it's impossible for the state to parse out the debts that are owed to the virtuous amongst us so we can forgive them, and those that are owed to the vicious amongst us so that they can't, the state faces a unique kind of moral dilemma that I've dealt with in some of my past writings, because the situation that's generated is inartfully called a quasi-supererogatory dilemma. Isn't that just a ridiculous name? That's in the literature. So quasi-supererogatory choices are required in circumstances in which there are no morally neutral options. One will either supererogate or one will suberogate. One will either go beyond any call of duty and so be a hero, or one will stand on one's rights in a way that really is an abuse of those rights and so be a moral louse. Yeah? So think, my favorite example of this is to get the flavor of it. Think of the brother who can save his dying sister only if he donates one of his kidneys to her. She clearly has no right to his kidney. So if he gives her a kidney, he supererogates. But since there's every reason to think that he'll live a healthy life without a kidney, his refusal to give her the kidney would constitute an instance of suberogation, right? He'd either be a hero or he'd be a louse. He faces no morally neutral alternative. Now, in the context of debt relief, the state faces a similar quasi-supererogatory dilemma. If the state discharges all onerous debts, it thereby compels the vicious, who would continue to press their repayment rights, it compels them to act as if they were virtuous. That is, it requires them to effectively supererogate, to absolve their debtors of financial obligations that they're fairly owed. But if the state refuses to discharge all such crushing debts, it forces the virtuous amongst us to be complicit in vice. That is, it requires us to do what is suberogatory by forcing us to continue to make those who are indebted to us suffer at our own hands. It requires us to continue to pay taxes in support of a legal apparatus that will continue to enforce contracts and tort judgments and tax debts and the like against those who are made miserable by their weight. So there's no morally neutral option that's available to the state. And we argue that when the state has to choose between virtue and vice, the state rightly puts the power of the law in the service of the virtuous rather than in the service of the vicious. It rightly compels the vicious to act as if they were virtuous rather than forcing the virtuous to be complicit in vice. But it doesn't do this because it's seeking to perfect its citizens' characters. It rather does this as a means of allowing the already virtuous to express their virtue when the alternative would be to lend the power of the law to those whose vice is not likely alterable. So the law of bankruptcy constitutes then a coordination solution for those who are virtuous but who cannot individually forgive the debts that are owed to them by those whose defaults have run up the costs of products and credit. It's a justified coordination solution for the state to broker precisely because if it didn't broker it, the state would be complicit in vice. And there we have it, a rapid fire summary of our theory of bankruptcy that finds the legitimacy of debt relief not in utilitarianism, not in rights theory, not in distributive justice, but rather in a theory of personal virtue. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.